Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, as the shadows lengthen and the vast silence of the world settles around us? Tonight, let us leave the familiar earth behind and step aboard a towering vessel of iron and fire, one of those great leviathans of the Victorian age, slicing its steady, inevitable path across the wide, restless ocean, where the true heart of human endeavor beat in time with a monstrous piston. The air is thick with the scent of brine and hot tallow, and the wooden planking beneath our feet trembles slightly with a deep, pervasive hum that promises both distance and destiny, reminding all who board that they have surrendered their immediate fates to the ingenuity of man and the indifferent power of the sea. This great ship, the Ethelred, is a world unto itself, a fleeting society built upon layers of rigid class and the shared necessity of progress, a floating microcosm of the very empire it serves, pushing steadily toward the horizon where the sun has long since sunk into a bank of gray mist. The ship is not merely a vessel, it is a profound declaration of industry, a mechanical beast whose massive paddle wheels, or perhaps the newer screw propeller, relentlessly churn the indigo deep into a frothing, milky wake that stretches miles behind us, dissolving the history of our departure into ephemeral bubbles. From the upper deck, clad in our heavy woolens and starched collars, we watch the last faint smudge of the European coastline vanish entirely, leaving nothing but the unbroken dome of sky meeting the sovereign flatness of the water, a perspective that simultaneously inspires awe and a deeply unsettling sense of human insignificance. This crossing requires fortitude, for it is a journey measured not in hours, but in the relentless, rhythmic passage of nights and days, where the land is a forgotten concept, and time itself seems to slow down, dictated only by the captain's bell and the constant, hungry consumption of coal in the fiery holds below. Beneath the polished mahogany of the saloon, and far below the gaze of the ladies discussing needlework and the gentlemen reading the latest dispatches, lies the true, sweating heart of the Ethelred, the engine room, a cavern of immense heat and ceaseless clanging motion where men are dwarfed by the machinery they tend. Here, the great brass cranks rise and fall with a terrible, majestic power, performing their perfect, pre-calculated dance, each revolution a calculated triumph over friction and resistance, driving thousands of tons of metal forward across the world's watery expanse. The air is almost suffocatingly hot, tasting of scorched oil and steam, and the stokers, ghosts wrapped in soot and muscle, feed the ravenous furnaces with shovelfuls of black fuel, their faces momentarily illuminated by the shocking, blinding white heat of the combustion chamber doors opening. The sound in this subterranean chamber is a magnificent, terrible cacophony. The deep, resounding thud of the piston hitting the cylinder head, the high, piercing hiss of escaping steam, the constant, metallic groan of stressed linkages, all woven together into a single, deafening narrative that speaks of brute force controlled by precision engineering. These men are the unsung priests of progress, dedicating their waking hours to the demanding, unforgiving worship of fire and iron, ensuring that the elaborate lives unfolding in the staterooms above are maintained in comfort and speed. Without their relentless vigilance against cooling steam or overheating bearings, the entire floating world would grind to an abrupt, silent, and perilous halt, leaving the ship a helpless derelict adrift beneath the cold, uncaring stars. Up on the promenade deck, where the sea air is clean and sharp, the scene is one of disciplined leisure and social performance, a stark contrast to the grueling reality miles below. Passengers of the first class, having donned their elaborate evening attire, the gentlemen in dark tailcoats, the ladies in silks and heavy velvets, congregate for the evening dinner, an event that is less a meal and more a rigorous test of etiquette and social standing. The long saloon, glittering with gaslight reflected in crystal and silver, smells faintly of roast beef, fine wine, and expensive perfume. The noise, a low murmur of refined conversation, punctuated by the discreet chink of silverware against porcelain plates decorated with the shipping line's ornate crest. Despite the illusion of stability offered by the ornate furnishings bolted firmly to the deck, a subtle, continuous sense of movement permeates every moment, a gentle, inexorable roll and pitch that is an ever-present reminder of the ship's actual environment. A certain sea-legged grace is required for the simplest tasks, like pouring tea or walking down the long carpeted corridor. And those who lack this acquired balance often cling awkwardly to the brass rails, their faces betraying a momentary anxiety about the vast, invisible depths sliding rapidly beneath the floorboards. Yet, even the most seasoned traveler finds themselves occasionally distracted by the sheer, magnificent mystery of the ocean outside the thick glass portholes, where nothing exists but infinite darkness and the reflection of their own candlelit faces looking back. For the younger passengers, particularly those making the long voyage to the colonies or returning home for schooling, the ship offers a dizzying landscape of novelty and constrained freedom, a space where strict societal rules briefly loosen under the shared necessity of the journey. They play games of shuffleboard on the painted deck or whisper secrets behind the canvas windbreaks, observing the curious, complex interactions of their elders with a mixture of childish disdain and nascent adult fascination. It is on these voyages that many first encounter the true spectrum of humanity, meeting not only the wealthy landowners and colonial administrators, but also the quiet engineers, the stoic stewardesses, and the secretive men of business, each carrying a hidden story woven into the fabric of the vessel. As midnight approaches, the great ship truly finds its voice. The general human noise recedes, replaced by the deep, consistent sound of the machinery, which transforms from a stressful roar into a meditative drone, the constant, comforting rhythm of the engines marking the relentless march of the night. The few remaining souls on the open decks stand silent against the vast, cold sweep of the wind, watching the moon, if visible, cast a silvery sheen upon the disturbed water, imagining the unseen thousands of fathoms below where eternal silence reigns. It is in these lonely hours, suspended between two worlds, that the traveler often finds a rare moment of genuine introspection, recognizing that the very speed and power of the steamship serves only to amplify the speed and power of one's own fleeting life, hurtling inevitably towards its distant destination. In the cramped quarters of the second-class cabins, located closer to the shuddering force of the propeller shaft, life is perhaps less polished, but far more communal and immediate, characterized by shared woes and the easy exchange of practical advice about the voyage ahead. Here, the partitions are thinner, the air is heavier, and the constant vibration makes sleeping a difficult, rocking affair. Yet there is a solidarity born of necessity that often eludes the reserved society of the upper decks. Men and women traveling for opportunity rather than recreation discuss crop yields, market prices, and the challenging realities of establishing a new home in an alien land, their hopes and anxieties laid bare beneath the single, weak electric bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling, swinging gently with the movement of the waves. The steward assigned to the first-class corridor maintains a rigorous, almost sacred routine, polishing the brass fixtures until they gleam like gold and ensuring that every detail, from the precise fold of the linen napkins to the temperature of the shaving water, adheres to the uncompromising standards of the era. He moves through the carpeted silence of the early morning hours like a shadow, anticipating needs before they are voiced, a silent witness to the various idiosyncrasies and eccentric demands of the privileged passengers he serves. This dedication to service is often remarked upon by the travelers as a mark of the line's quality, yet few pause to consider the long hours and personal sacrifices required to maintain this elaborate performance of effortless luxury across thousands of miles of open sea. During the middle hours of the day, When the sun hangs bright and blinding over the water, those seeking philosophical contemplation often retreat to the ship's small, specialized library, stocked with heavy, leather-bound volumes deemed suitable for long sea voyages, histories, classical literature, and weighty theological treatises. The atmosphere within this small room is hushed and still, smelling faintly of old paper and dust, offering a temporary, intellectual refuge from the relentless physical motion of the ship and the sometimes exhausting social demands of the dining saloon. One might find an elderly scholar poring over Milton, or a young lady reading Byron, finding solace in the established continuity of human thought set against the overwhelming discontinuity of the ocean waves flashing past the nearby windows. The captain, a figure of remote, almost mythical authority, rarely mingles with the general passenger list, maintaining an essential separation that reinforces his sovereign command over the Ethelred and the hundreds of lives entrusted to his judgment. His presence is felt rather than seen, a steadfast assurance that amidst the vast indifference of the deep, a guiding intellect is constantly engaged in calculation, measuring the wind speed, charting the course against unseen currents, and predicting the temperament of the approaching weather systems that might challenge the integrity of the iron hull. When he does appear on the bridge, his quiet demeanor and measured speech immediately communicate competence, calming any subconscious anxieties that might stir among those who momentarily glance up at his silhouette against the sky. The smoking room, a sanctuary reserved exclusively for gentlemen, is perhaps the one space on the ship where formal constraints are slightly relaxed, allowing for more robust conversation fueled by brandy and the dense, blue clouds of cigar smoke that hang perpetually in the stale air. Here, deals are subtly negotiated, political opinions are fiercely debated, and profound secrets about business or personal life are often confessed in the dim, confidential light, only to be forgotten or perhaps strategically remembered by the time the vessel finally docks in port. It is a necessary theater for the male ambition of the age, a small, enclosed space of human heat and tension set against the cold immensity of the surrounding world, a place where vulnerability and predatory intent often mingle in equal measure. For the third-class passengers, or steerage, relegated to the lowest decks and the farthest reaches of the ship, the voyage is a raw experience defined by crammed proximity and the incessant, deafening drone of the engine and the churning propeller directly beneath their berths. These individuals, often entire families emigrating with meager possessions and grand, desperate hopes, experience the sea in its most immediate and unforgiving form. Tossed about by every swell and shudder, their view limited to small, often non-existent portholes that offer only a distant sense of the daylight above. Their sustenance is simple and strictly rationed, and their shared endurance forms a silent, powerful bond, knowing that they are paying the highest cost, physically and emotionally, for the promise of a future waiting on the other side of the unrelenting sea. As the voyage enters its final days, a perceptible shift occurs in the atmosphere of the ship. The initial novelty has long faded, replaced by a quiet, collective impatience and a focusing of anticipation upon the eventual sight of land, now only a matter of detailed navigational certainty. Suitcases begin to reappear from storage, documents are reread with meticulous care, and conversations inevitably turn from the trivialities of the immediate journey to the practicalities of arrival, customs, transport, and the reunion with waiting loved ones, or the formidable challenge of beginning anew. Even the rhythmic noise of the engine seems to quicken slightly, lending a nervous energy to the air, as if the great mechanical heart senses the imminent end of its powerful, sustained effort across the watery wilderness. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Captain Atherton, a man whose face had been weathered into a roadmap of old voyages, spent these final nights glued to the bridge, relying less now on the stars which had guided them across the vast middle emptiness, and more on the precise, meticulous calculations of his navigating officers. He felt the ship not merely as a machine beneath his feet, but as a temporary, self-contained world filled with fragile human cargo, each soul representing a destiny he was charged with delivering intact, an immense, invisible pressure that only intensified with the approaching coast. The rhythmic tick of the chronometers and the low, reassuring drone of the telegraph bell were the sounds of his devotion, marking the steady, undeniable consumption of the distance, bringing the great iron beast inexorably toward its destination across the dense, moonless water. Deep within the steel belly of the vessel, where the heat was perpetual and the air tasted of hot brass and lubricating oil, the engineering crew maintained their relentless vigil, shoveling coal and monitoring the immense throbbing cylinders that drove the screw through the resisting water. These stokers and oilers, faces blackened by the soot that clung even to their sweat, felt the end of the journey less as a moment of liberation and more as the promise of respite, a brief cessation of the deafening roar and the back-breaking labor that had defined their existence for weeks on end. They were the silent, powerful priests of the industrial age, ensuring that the necessary mechanical miracle continued unabated, a continuous testament to human ingenuity and the unforgiving laws of thermodynamics, readying the enormous engine for the critical slowdown required for the eventual harbor approach. In the tight confines of the steerage decks, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp wool and fresh soap, as families undertook the serious ritual of cleansing themselves and their meager wardrobes for the moment of landfall. Cracked leather boots were polished until they offered a meager reflection, and carefully folded dresses, reserved for the momentous occasion, were gingerly unpacked from heavy trunks, symbols of the dignity they desperately wished to present to their new world. The children, usually restless and vocal, sensed the monumental shift in their parents' demeanor, sitting still and wide-eyed, absorbing the concentrated anxiety and soaring ambition that radiated from the adults who were about to exchange the known suffering of the journey for the unknown possibility of a fresh start. This preparation was not merely cosmetic. It was a profound spiritual gearing up, an act of intentional renewal, demanding every ounce of strength salvaged from the long passage. In the opulent dining saloons and private suites of the upper decks, the routine, though more comfortable, was also dissolving under the pressure of arrival, as stewards meticulously packed away silver services and secured expensive luggage. The grand dames and gentlemen, who had grown accustomed to the structured boredom of afternoon bridge and lengthy, heavy dinners, now faced the tedious necessity of managing their finances and reaffirming business arrangements, exchanging the pleasant detachment of the ocean for the demanding schedules of commerce. A subtle, shared melancholy often settled over the first-class passengers as well, a strange regret at the necessary dissolution of this luxurious, isolated society, where status was immutable and responsibilities were momentarily suspended by the vast, indifferent ocean. Even amidst their comfort, they understood that the ship had been a privileged pause, and the real pressures of their established lives were rapidly approaching the docks to claim them once more. Then, in the dark hours just before the dawn of the final scheduled day, an unmistakable, primal signal traveled across the water, reaching the ship like a whispered prophecy: the scent of land. It was not the crisp, sterile scent of pure brine they had become used to, but a complex, earthy fragrance, a blending of moist, decaying leaves, the sharp, resinous tang of pine forest, and, carried on the stronger currents, the faint, metallic aroma of coal smoke and distant, thriving industry. This subtle perfume permeated the open spaces, drifting down the ventilation shafts and mingling with the ship's own heavy, mechanical breath, causing dozens of sleepers to wake simultaneously, drawing deep, grateful breaths of air that felt suddenly solid, dense, and full of terrestrial promise. The scent was confirmation not only of position, but of profound change, the first true difference in the sensory world after weeks of unchanging sea and sky. As the sun finally rose, burning away the last wisps of coastal fog, the first physical evidence of the continent materialized on the starboard bow. A low, slate-gray smudge on the horizon, too static to be cloud and too firm to be mere shadow, quickly resolving itself into the unmistakable, monumental profile of shore. A spontaneous, powerful surge of emotion swept across the decks, overriding all previous concerns of class or conduct, drawing hundreds of passengers to the railings, their faces wrapped and streaming with tears of sheer, overwhelming relief, suddenly remembering the exact feeling of stability. Hands pointed silently toward the emerging coastline, acknowledging the culmination of weeks of relentless travel. A mass confession that the hope they had carried was now physically, tangibly validated by the presence of solid ground after the endless, shifting, liquid wilderness. The powerful engines, which had pushed the great hull with such furious consistency, began to slow and soften their rhythm, transitioning from the deep, throaty roar of ocean travel to the methodical, punctuated beat of coastal approach, causing the ship to glide rather than hammer through the water. The deep, indifferent blue of the open ocean swiftly gave way to a shallower, turbulent green, littered with the debris of nearshore life and marked by the sudden appearance of local traffic, small, fast-moving fishing smacks, and the purposeful, bulky shapes of harbor tugs. The captain's attention shifted fully to the delicate maneuver of threading the massive vessel into the recognized sea lanes, the final and most complex phase of the journey, requiring immense precision and the eventual, necessary guidance of the local harbor pilot, whose small, swift boat was already cutting through the waves to meet them. The arrival of the pilot, a weathered man stepping confidently onto the rope ladder tossed down from the towering deck, signaled the formal handover of command from the isolation of the high seas to the strictures of the port authority, a momentary drama observed in respectful silence by the assembled passengers. He brought with him the most precious cargo of all, late newspapers filled with recent events and advertisements that seemed impossibly vibrant and demanding after the muted existence aboard the steamer. As the pilot ascended, clutching his log and navigating charts, he shouted quick, efficient instructions to the bridge, simultaneously integrating the massive ocean liner into the precise choreography of the busy harbor mouth. Down in steerage, the sound of the anchor chain being prepared, a metallic rattling, heavy and decisive, sent a final, expectant shudder through the hull, prompting the exhausted emigrants to gather their final, small bundles of possessions in tight, protective grips. They knew that in a few hours, the vertical divide of the gangplank would separate them forever from the collective suffering they had shared, sending them out as isolated atoms into the intimidating chaos of the port city. Despite the overwhelming promise of the land now visible, a residue of apprehension remained, clinging to their hearts like the coal dust that still settled faintly on their borrowed Sunday clothes, aware that the true labor, the struggle for acceptance and survival, was only just beginning. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The immediate sensation following the pilot's arrival was the profound, almost dizzying return of urgency. For the newspapers, still smelling faintly of ink and the land, acted as a cruel mirror reflecting the speed at which the world had continued without the travelers. Ladies in the first-class saloon, having spent weeks contemplating only the horizon and the changing light, were suddenly compelled to consider the strictures of London's high season, rushing to scribble notes regarding tailors, social engagements, and the vital necessity of having their heaviest silks pressed immediately upon docking. Gentlemen, previously content with deep reading and cigars, now spread out financial pages, their faces tightening with the sudden realization of market shifts and business risks they could no longer afford to ignore, transforming their relaxed maritime demeanor back into the sharp-edged professionalism demanded by commerce. The deep, meditative peace of the open ocean evaporated entirely, replaced by the humming anxiety of civilization demanding immediate return to its relentless pace. A transition so swift it left the soul momentarily breathless. With the ship now secured precisely against the stone quay, the bureaucratic heart of the port began to beat, manifest first in the arrival of the formidable customs men, clad in dark, heavy wool coats and carrying leather satchels thick with manifests and official stamps. These men, stern and impervious, proceeded with an air of detached authority, moving through the decks with the confidence of those who understood the infinite complexities of import duties and prohibited goods, treating every passenger's luggage as a potential repository of illicit wealth or dangerous ideas. For the passengers in the upper decks, this inspection was often a matter of a brief, polite exchange and the quick turning of a key, facilitated by the quiet presence of a steward or a small offering of silver, affirming the established order where privilege smoothed the path of scrutiny. Conversely, for those deep below, the customs inspection would feel like an interrogation, an intrusive peering into their meager belongings that seemed to question the very legality of their hope and poverty, demanding precise answers in an unfamiliar tongue. The final shipboard meal, taken in the dining salon while the sounds of the shore, harsh and unfamiliar, drifted in through the open portholes, was a curious blend of festivity and profound distraction. A momentary lapse of focus as silverware clinked against china for the last time under the sway of the ship's gentle movement. Waiters moved with a heightened efficiency, already stripping the tables of superfluous ornaments, their minds focused on the rapid turnaround required before the next sailing, their service losing the personalized attention it had held during the long voyage. Polite conversations concerning the weather and the merits of the journey now dissolved into immediate, practical planning, arrangements for hiring a hansom cab, securing railway tickets, or confirming appointments with solicitors, each word signifying a swift and absolute divergence of paths. Even the taste of the fresh fruit and delicate pastry seemed subdued, overshadowed by the sudden, pressing flavor of the imminent separation and the realization that the temporary society forged by shared isolation was already fragilely breaking apart. Meanwhile, in the vast, echoing space of the steerage hold, preparation was grim and final, characterized not by leisurely dining, but by the relentless, organized sorting of human beings into manageable groups determined by their intended final destination, nationality, or the official documents they clutched. The heavy iron bars and rough wooden benches, which had been temporary homes and sickbeds, now stood exposed in their stark utility, stripped of the small, personal comforts they had momentarily provided, awaiting the scraping and scrubbing that would obliterate the evidence of the recent passage. Exhaustion mixed with raw anticipation made the air thick and restless, and though the hull had ceased its ocean sway, the bodies of the emigrants still subconsciously compensated for motion, causing them to lean slightly as they stood packed together, watching the narrow stairway that represented their only exit to the promised land. They listened intently to the booming voices of the foreign officials beginning to read names from a roster, each syllable holding the power to either release them into freedom or delay their entry indefinitely, a nervous tension so great it stifled even the cries of the youngest children. The sound of the first clatter of the heavy, cleated gangplank being lowered and locked into place against the quay was a sound charged with monumental significance. A physical bridge connecting the liquid uncertainty of the sea to the immovable certainty of the land, an invitation they had risked everything to receive. The officials, customs, health, and immigration, formed a gauntlet at the foot of the ramp, demanding clear visibility of all faces, searching for the telltale signs of fever or contagious melancholy that might necessitate quarantine or refusal of entry. performing a ruthless, quick assessment of worthiness. As the first small groups of families were permitted to descend, clutching their infants and their worn luggage, the transition was visually dramatic, moving from the enclosed, shaded space of the ship's hull into the blinding, expansive light of the waterfront, an almost shocking sensory assault of color and noise. The solid ground beneath their worn boots felt strangely resilient and unyielding after the constant flexibility of the deck, momentarily throwing off their equilibrium, a subtle physical metaphor for the difficulty of adjusting to the permanence of the new world. The dockside itself was an overwhelming symphony of industrial confusion, a landscape dominated by the massive, smoke-stained brick warehouses that stretched away into the hazy distance, and the incessant, deafening clang of iron against iron as freight was loaded and unloaded with violent speed. Porters, shouting in dialects incomprehensible to the newcomers, darted through the tightly packed space, balancing impossible stacks of crates and luggage on their backs, treating the human crowd with curt impatience, demanding paths be cleared for the true business of the port, the exchange of goods. The newly arrived emigrants, burdened by their possessions and the heavy weight of their own disorientation, stood frozen momentarily, trying desperately to reconcile the vision of the shimmering, prosperous city they had imagined with this harsh, utilitarian reality, a place of hard labor and sudden, dangerous movement. They struggled to decode the massive wooden signs painted with the names of shipping companies and transit hotels, searching for the prearranged contacts or the railway station signs that would mark the next stage of their seemingly endless journey toward stability. In sharp contrast to the teeming chaos where the steerage passengers waited, the departure of the first-class travelers unfolded with meticulous, prearranged grace, managed entirely by the small army of private footmen, carriage drivers, and hotel runners who had gathered just beyond the immediate boundary of the customs shed. For these wealthy passengers, the transition was less a frightening plunge into the unknown and more a smooth, instantaneous reabsorption into the world of luxury they had only momentarily left, with heavy leather trunks being whisked away by reliable hands and deposited safely into waiting four-wheeled carriages drawn by perfectly groomed horses. There was a notable absence of shouting or frantic motion among the elite, only the quiet, efficient exchange of instructions and the soft shutting of carriage doors, as they were spirited away from the grime and the crowds of the docks toward the clean, quiet anonymity of the exclusive city hotels and townhouses. From the polished windows of their departing vehicles, they might briefly observe the struggling, bewildered masses of the newly arrived, a distant tableau of human struggle that confirmed the comfort of their own privileged existence before turning their attention back to the pressing matter of their dinner reservations. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The moment the last polished carriage wheel turned away, vanishing around the corner of the brick warehouses, an unnatural quiet descended upon the remaining multitude of newly arrived souls, a silence far more oppressive than the clamor it replaced. It was the silence of utter abandonment, the crushing realization that the great, loud mechanism of the ship and the port had discharged them and instantly forgotten their existence, leaving them standing amidst piles of worn canvas bags and tied bundles that represented their entire worldly stake. Here, in the afternoon shadow of the colossal custom house, they finally grasped the sheer, terrifying scale of the city they had sailed across the ocean to meet, a place utterly indifferent to their fatigue, their hopes, or their precarious financial balance. Thomas, clutching the frayed handle of a heavy wooden chest containing his meager tools, watched his wife, Alara, nervously adjust the shawl wrapped around their youngest child, who was already flushed and fretful from the long exposure to the humid port air. The ground beneath their cheap, worn boots was gritty with coal dust and the refuse of 1,000 other arrivals, and the air carried the sharp tang of tidal mud and brine, mixed with the pervasive, sickly scent of gaslight pollution from the looming streets. They knew only that they must find the lodging house mentioned in a soiled letter, a place miles inland through a confusing maze of avenues that offered no signposts legible to the truly desperate, relying solely on the vague, hurried directions shouted by a distant official. This initial move away from the safety of the known dockyard became a heavy, staggering procession, where every step demanded a calculated expenditure of energy that they scarcely possessed after weeks of restricted rations. For those who had sailed in the upholstered comfort of the higher decks, arrival was merely the changing of a theater set, a brief, well-managed pause before the next performance of their privileged lives resumed in a new city drawing room or a profitable banking engagement. They carried within them the certainty of immediate welcome and the assurance of perfect predictability, their wealth acting as an impenetrable shield against the unpredictable currents of the foreign land, making the experience of travel indistinguishable from the comfort of staying home. Yet, for the multitudes now shuffling slowly into the industrial heart of the city, arrival was an absolute terminus and a frightening new beginning all at once, marking the end of the sea-tossed journey only to plunge them into the greater, deeper uncertainty of existence itself, where every closed door represented a potential failure or a refusal. This contrast defined the Great Divide. For the few, the world was a map of opportunities to be claimed. For the many, it was a gauntlet of hardships to be endured. Meanwhile, several miles away, Lord Ashworth stepped into the hushed, velvet-draped lobby of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, where the temperature, lighting, and sound levels were all meticulously controlled to exclude the unpleasant reality of the street just outside the ornate revolving doors. His luggage, having already been inspected and sorted by the hotel's dedicated staff, was being carried upward in the electric lift by a silently moving page, while a deferential clerk presented him with the room key and the stack of waiting correspondence that had arrived over the fortnight of his transatlantic crossing. Within minutes, he was established in a suite overlooking a manicured public square, surrounded by the familiar comfort of heavy mahogany furniture, crisp white linens, and the discreet chime of a servant summoned by a silver bell, the sea voyage already receding into the faint, easily forgotten memory of a slight rocking motion that only briefly interrupted the stately rhythm of his life. Lord Ashworth's anxieties were not those of hunger or shelter, but rather the heavier, abstract weights of social expectation and immense financial negotiation concerning the merger of several South American railway bonds that required his immediate attention before the closing of the exchange. He carried the burden of millions and the responsibility of hundreds of employees, a pressure invisible to the eye but keenly felt in the slight tightness across his temples as he broke the seal on the first telegram concerning the stock market fluctuations that had occurred during his absence at sea. This was his true work, the deployment of capital and influence that defined his class and justified the vast consumption of resources, and the physical ease of his surroundings merely provided the necessary fortress from which to prosecute this relentless, quiet war of commerce. He felt a profound obligation to this structured, costly world, a sense of duty that, in its own way, was just as confining as the walls of the steerage compartment, though the gilded cage afforded a view of endless possibility. Back nearer the docks, Thomas and Alara found themselves deep within the churning arteries of the industrial quarter, where the pavement was slick with oily residue, and the air vibrated with the clang and hiss of unseen machinery operating beyond towering brick walls. The sheer density of human life here was overwhelming. A press of weary laborers, ragged street vendors, and barking costermongers whose voices were swallowed instantly by the constant, dull roar of the city's endless enterprise, creating a sonic blanket that pressed down upon the weary travelers. They navigated narrow streets shadowed by smoke-blackened tenements that rose 6 or 7 stories high, each window displaying some small, desperate sign of life or laundry strung haphazardly across the narrow gaps between buildings, offering the weary newcomer a stark, immediate lesson in metropolitan compression. Every new corner they turned presented a further dissipation of hope, replacing the clean horizon of the ocean with the suffocating, immediate reality of poverty already entrenched and waiting to absorb them into its grimy, anonymous flow. They navigated narrow streets shadowed by smoke-blackened tenements that rose 6 or 7 stories high, each window displaying some small, desperate sign of life, or laundry strung haphazardly across the narrow gaps between buildings, offering the weary newcomer a stark, immediate lesson in metropolitan compression. Every new corner they turned presented a further dissipation of hope, replacing the clean horizon of the ocean with the suffocating, immediate reality of poverty already entrenched and waiting to absorb them into its grimy, anonymous flow. The path Thomas and Elara were forced to follow led them through the markets, past heaps of discarded produce and broken crates where children darted like hungry sparrows, and the smell of stale beer and unwashed humanity mixed powerfully with the sharp fumes of manufactories processing hides and metals. Elara worried incessantly about the baby, whose breathing had grown shallow and rapid in the polluted air, but Thomas insisted they could not stop, knowing that to rest was to invite the exhaustion that would make starting again impossible, and that their few remaining shillings must be reserved strictly for the promised rental fee. They passed taverns where lamps were already being lit, casting a lurid yellow glow onto the rough faces of men drinking away the meager earnings of the day, their laughter harsh and indifferent to the newcomers struggling past with their pitiful bundles and their weary, wide-eyed bewilderment. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the upper reaches of the smog-choked sky and bruised shades of purple and orange, the light struggled to reach the cobbled lanes where the newly arrived walked, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock the smallness of their figures and the size of their task. It illuminated the gleaming brass railings of the grand hotels simultaneously with the broken panes and peeling paint of the crowded lodging houses, proving that the sun's warmth falls equally upon all, but the means of protection from the inevitable chill of night are distributed with terrible inequity by the hands of men. They walked onward, Thomas gripping Elara's hand tightly, trusting in the sheer brute necessity that a new life waited, though the initial landscape offered little more than struggle, noise, and the deep, pervasive smell of coal smoke mingled with the unfamiliar tang of 10,000 different, struggling human lives pressed together. They moved toward the deeper shadows of the city's interior, propelled by the faint but potent dream of earning a future, brick by painstaking brick. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? They turned at last off the wide, noisy thoroughfare and into a narrow, cobbled alleyway that offered the dubious shelter of the lodging house, a dilapidated, leaning structure pressed tightly between two looming brick warehouses, smelling strongly of stale cooking grease and unwashed wool. The narrow entryway was cloaked in perpetual gloom, despite the solitary gas lamp sputtering weakly just outside, and they exchanged a nervous, reassuring glance, understanding instantly that dignity was an expensive commodity not sold within these cramped walls, only tolerated outside them. They pushed open the heavy, splintered door, the loud groan of the hinges announcing their arrival to the 100 souls already seeking shelter in the close confines of the building, each of them a silent, exhausted testament to the city's vast hunger and the ceaseless, private struggle for survival. Their room, which they secured after a brief, stern transaction with a slatternly landlady who counted their remaining shillings twice before ever looking at their faces, was merely a partition of thin lath and plaster, offering privacy in name only, separated from the neighboring sleepers by sounds and smells rather than true distance. They carefully placed their meager possessions beneath the low, sloping ceiling, careful not to dislodge the peeling wallpaper that hung in strips like tattered flags of surrender, while the shared mattress offered little comfort, being a mere sack filled with unfamiliar lumps and harboring the faint, metallic scent of previous occupants. Yet, as Thomas banked the small, precious fire in the grate using the tiny allowance of coal they had purchased, they felt a fragile sense of safety, knowing that for this one night, the biting indifference of the street was held at bay, allowing them the necessary sleep for the arduous commencement of their new vocation. Sleep was a fragmented and patchy affair, constantly interrupted by the rattling of heavy dray carts moving through the alley outside, the muffled arguments and rasping coughs from the adjacent rooms, and the incessant high-pitched whine of the port city's life that never truly ceased, even under the thick cloak of midnight. Alara lay awake, watching the flickering shadows cast by the moon's weak beam struggling to pierce the grimy windowpane, contemplating the staggering journey they had undertaken, a passage built entirely upon faith in Thomas's enduring strength and the desperate, profound need to escape the slow demise promised by their abandoned life. Thomas, sensing her quiet wakefulness and the anxiety that held her still, reached across the narrow bed to grip her hand firmly, a silent promise passed between their calloused palms that, though the ground beneath them was uncertain, they were navigating this treacherous tide together, two small vessels lashed securely against the inevitable coming storm. Long before the official signal of dawn, marked only by a slight thinning of the pervasive smog, they rose, tying their sturdy boots and sharing a frugal, solemn breakfast of hard biscuit and weak, lukewarm tea brewed over the embers of the previous night's fire. The hallway outside was already teeming with other men similarly prepared for the day's grueling tasks, their faces grim and unsmiling, their movements practiced in the severe economy of effort required by endless manual labor, each man seeking the early advantage in the daily competition for the least cruel work available on the great docks. They joined the silent, dark procession descending the creaking wooden stairs, emerging onto the damp, shadowed streets where the morning air was noticeably sharper, now carrying the unmistakable odors of brine, tar, and immense industry, calling them onward toward the churning, working heart of the great port. The cramped lanes broadened quickly into wide thoroughfares leading directly to the water's edge, where the true, terrifying scale of the city's commerce became profoundly apparent, presenting a colossal, smoky landscape dominated by masts that pierced the low ceiling of cloud and the immense, brooding shapes of steam-powered vessels waiting to swallow their cargo. The noise here was a deafening symphony, composed of the deep-throated, mournful whistles of the great ships, the rhythmic clanging of iron on stone, and the constant, directional cries of the dock foreman directing the legions of laborers moving like tireless, organized ants beneath the towering machinery of cranes and derricks. Thomas felt his chest tighten, not exactly from fear, but from the sudden, profound realization of his own physical insignificance within this immense, churning mechanism, understanding that he was merely one tiny, replaceable cog in a massive engine designed solely for the relentless, pitiless pursuit of profit across the vast, indifferent oceans. They sought out the specific docks allocated to the transatlantic vessels, finally finding the berth where the great ship lay waiting, a magnificent, floating citadel named the Parnassus, her black hull rising 50 feet above the water, lined with 3 gleaming white decks and crowned by twin stacks that intermittently belched great plumes of thick, oily black smoke into the pallid morning sky. This vessel was more than mere transport. It was an engine of destiny, a complex labyrinth of iron, brass, and steam designed with audacious ambition to conquer the terrifying vastness of the Atlantic, carrying not just goods, but the distilled hopes, the shattered fortunes, and the desperate final chances of hundreds of individuals seeking passage to the promised lands across the western horizon. The sheer sight of the massive ship was overwhelming, yet it offered a necessary clarity. Their struggle was not petty or small, but was intertwined with the grand, sweeping narratives of global migration and technological mastery that defined the new century, making their tiny, personal efforts feel momentarily consequential. Thomas presented his small, carefully folded letter of introduction, written by the foreman of their former, much smaller shipyard, to a robust, red-faced shipping agent who barely glanced up from his perpetually open ledger, merely nodding dismissively toward the gaping hatches of the lower holds. Thomas was immediately assigned to a crew responsible for loading coal into the massive bunkers deep beneath the engine room, a task known throughout the docks for its choking heat, its relentless, unforgiving pace, and the fine, insidious dust that quickly permeated clothing, skin, and lungs alike, turning men into gray, ghostly shadows of themselves within the first agonizing hour of work. The agent spoke only 3 curt, impersonal sentences, detailing the abysmal nature of the pay, the expected hours that stretched without pause from the first light until physical exhaustion, and the strict requirement for total, unquestioning obedience to the ship's complex hierarchy, before dismissing Thomas with a simple flick of his hand and moving swiftly to address the next desperate soul awaiting instruction. The agent spoke only 3 curt, impersonal sentences, detailing the abysmal nature of the pay, the expected hours that stretched without pause from the first light until physical exhaustion, and the strict requirement for total, unquestioning obedience to the ship's complex hierarchy, before dismissing Thomas with a simple flick of his hand and moving swiftly to address the next desperate soul awaiting instruction. Ilara, meanwhile, moved toward the section allocated for crew accommodations, seeking the chief stewardess, a severe woman with a tightly pinned cap and eyes that missed nothing of the goings-on around her, whom she approached with a deference born entirely of necessity and an understanding of the power dynamics at play. She was swiftly accepted to assist the laundresses servicing the second-class quarters, an environment less physically brutal than the deep, smoky holds, but demanding a unique patience and endurance of a different, more exacting kind, involving endless hours of scrubbing heavy, soaked linens and painstakingly ironing the delicate laces of those wealthy enough to travel in comparative comfort. Though the work would be utterly exhausting and the hours long, keeping her entirely separate from Thomas for much of the day and night, they both took solace in the crucial knowledge that they were officially registered, their passage secured entirely through the grinding expenditure of their own collective physical efforts, tethered irrevocably to the great metal beast that would carry them across the threshold of their uncertain future. Thomas descended the steep, slick metal ladders into the rumbling depths of the ship, the air growing thick and intensely humid as he passed the rhythmic, thunderous pounding of the great reciprocating engines, each powerful beat a mighty pulse driving the vessel forward, symbolizing the relentless, unceasing drive of the modern industrial world. The coal bunker was an immense, echoing cavern of profound blackness and suffocating dust, filled with the rasping coughs of the other stokers, men hardened and prematurely aged by years of servitude to the hungry fire, their faces smeared dark with grime, their expressions bearing the dull resignation that comes from laboring perpetually just inches away from unbearable, searing heat. He swung his heavy shovel high for the very first time, feeling the immediate, unfamiliar ache in muscles that had only known the slightly different strains of carpentry, acknowledging soberly that this was the true cost of their ticket. the slow, systematic expenditure of his own youth and strength exchanged utterly for the potent, distant promise of freedom. Up above, Ilara found her post within the steaming confines of the laundry, a cramped, low-ceilinged space perpetually fogged by boiling water and heated pressing irons, the atmosphere heavy with the clean, sharp scent of strong, industrial soap contrasting sharply with the smells of sweat and oil that clung to the men in the engine room far below. The women worked in silent, focused concentration, their hands moving with bewildering speed as they sorted, scrubbed, wrung, and pressed the endless, staggering stacks of linen required to maintain the illusion of ease for the paying passengers, a tireless, meticulous operation conducted entirely beneath the polished decks where the travelers promenaded obliviously. She quickly learned the precise, unforgiving rhythm demanded by her stern supervisor, focusing intensely on the repetitive motion of her hands against the washing board, allowing the physical exertion to dull the sharp edge of her anxiety about the daunting future and the immediate, constant worry for Thomas laboring in the choking heat far beneath the waterline. The first full day passed in a hazy cycle of relentless movement, the ship being readied for departure with a ferocious intensity that seemed to consume the laborers whole, forcing them beyond the limits of mere fatigue into a state of stunned, numb endurance. Thomas emerged from the bows of the Parnassus that evening, black from head to toe, the coal dust clinging to the sweat on his brow, the dirt making his teeth look startlingly white when he attempted a weary, reassuring smile for Ilara as they met briefly in the chaotic twilight of the dockside. He felt the unsettling, deep-seated vibrations of the massive engines even through the stone of the dock, sensing that the ship was already awakening, stirring from its slumber, preparing to finally tear itself free from the tethering ropes and commence its momentous journey. Ilara gripped Thomas's arm tightly as they navigated the surging tide of humanity flowing toward the gangplanks, observing the stark division between the elegant, veiled ladies ascending the polished first-class ramp and the rough, bundled men being herded toward the lower decks, their passage marked by necessity rather than leisure. Their identification papers were checked with curt efficiency by a harried ship's officer, who marked their names off a long, stained manifest with an impatient scratch of his pen, officially severing their link to the known world and certifying their consignment to the sea. As Thomas stepped onto the steel deck, the deep vibration he had sensed the day before now intensified beneath his feet, a low, powerful hum suggesting the vast, latent energy coiled within the metal behemoth, readying itself for the moment of oceanic release. They shared a quick, silent farewell near the cavernous opening leading to the engine rooms, a place Thomas referred to simply as the pit, where the temperature was already soaring despite the morning chill above deck, the heat rising like a foul, hot breath. Ilara pressed a single, cool cloth into his blackened hand, a small, useless gesture against the inferno he was about to face, and he descended quickly, swallowed by the gloom and the rhythmic clangor of machinery being tested, the heavy metal door closing with a definitive, mournful thud. She watched the door until she could no longer bear the sight of its finality, then turned resolutely to find the cramped space they had been allotted amidst the steerage passengers, a tiny sanctuary that would serve as their only constant for the next many weeks of ceaseless motion. The steerage quarters were a labyrinth of narrow passages and stacked bunks, smelling strongly of stale humanity, cheap canvas, and the oil used to preserve the hull from corrosion. Ilara found their allotted bunk, the lower one of a pair, thankfully, deep within the hull, its proximity to the vibrating shell of the ship making rest seem a distant, challenging possibility. Yet it was theirs, and she spread their few blankets upon the hard mattress with a fierce possessiveness. Settled amidst the whispering anxiety and restless movements of her fellow travelers, she listened, waiting for the signs of departure, finding a strange comfort in the shared uncertainty that united this huddled community of hopeful exiles. Below decks, Thomas surrendered himself instantly to the staggering heat and the overwhelming noise, descending 3 further levels into the heart of the vessel, where the great boilers glowed a terrifying, healthy red, demanding constant sustenance. He joined his watch gang, 8 men, shirtless and streaming sweat already, and together they began the final, punishing ritual of preparation, moving wheelbarrows laden with black gold across the vibrating steel plates, stacking the fuel within reach of the monstrous furnaces. The air was so dense with heat and dust that breathing became a conscious, painful effort, and Thomas felt the world contract until it consisted only of the shovel, the coal, and the ceaseless, hungry roar of the fire. The chief engineer, a grizzled man named Mr. Harding, whose voice was a permanent rasp over the machine noise, moved among the men with quiet authority, adjusting valves and peering at gauges that spoke of unimaginable pressures contained merely by thick steel and the grace of mechanical engineering. He reminded the stokers that the ship's journey, and indeed their very lives, depended utterly upon the consistency of the heat and the steady hand of the coal heavers, a brutal, simple philosophy that stripped away all grand notions of travel and reduced the enterprise to basic thermodynamics. For Thomas, this subterranean labor became a profound meditation on pure necessity, where every aching muscle and every bead of sweat was a measured payment toward the promised future. The high, throaty blast of the ship's main whistle cut through the dockside pandemonium above, silencing the gulls and the frantic shouting, a deep, resonating sound that vibrated not just in the ear, but in the very core of the body. A signal that patience had run out and the hour of severance had arrived. Below, Thomas and his crewmates braced themselves instinctively against the steel plating as the great screws began their slow, churning rotation, the massive engine components clicking and turning over for the first time with real, directed power, responding to the fire they fed. He felt the ship shudder, a deep, complex tremor running the length of the hull, and knew that they were now actively pushing away from the fixed world of the shore. Up on the main deck, leaning against a railing already streaked with soot, Ilara watched the immense coils of rope being thrown clear, splashing into the dark harbor water, released from their duty, a final, concrete symbol of the decision made. The dockside figures, the bustling workers and the onlookers began to shrink, transforming from detailed humans into indistinct shapes and then into mere smudges against the stone walls of the city. She gazed upon the receding skyline, finding herself suddenly struck by the beautiful, impossible geometry of the receding brick and glass, recognizing it as the last image of the familiar world she might ever hold, a photograph etched indelibly upon her memory. The Parnassus slowly turned its massive prow toward the mouth of the harbor, navigating the congested waterway with a deliberate, almost arrogant grace, the smoke from its 4 tall funnels billowing forth in black plumes that stained the pale afternoon sky. The engine noise increased in pitch and tempo, transforming from a tentative groan into a fierce, metronomic beat, the relentless heart of the ship now fully engaged in its great effort to conquer the water. Ilara felt a peculiar shift within her spirit, the subtle dread of leaving being slowly replaced by the exhilarating, terrifying sensation of forward motion, the commitment now sealed and immutable. As the ship cleared the protective arms of the harbor walls and met the open swell of the ocean, a new movement was introduced. A long, slow, powerful roll that demonstrated the water's vast indifference to the vessel's speed or power. Below, the motion was magnified, making the shoveling of coal an even more precarious and demanding task, requiring the men to plant their feet wide and shift their weight constantly to compensate for the ship's ponderous swaying. The noise of the machinery was no longer distinct, but a single, deafening wall of sound, an unending metal scream that seemed to press against the limits of sanity, forcing the laborers into a state of hypnotic, sustained action. The noise of the machinery was no longer distinct, but a single, deafening wall of sound, an unending metal scream that seemed to press against the limits of sanity, forcing the laborers into a state of hypnotic, sustained action. In the steerage bunk, Ilara lay awake long after the evening meal, the sounds of her neighbors drifting into strained silence as the ship surged ahead into the rising night, the water slapping loudly against the steel skin just feet from her head. She knew Thomas was now deep within the earth of the vessel, surrounded by the terrifying heat and light of the engines, the sole intermediary between the raw coal and the incredible force that propelled their world onward into the unknown darkness. The motion of the ship became her new cradle, rocking her not toward rest, but toward a profound realization of their utter reliance upon this intricate, violent machine, their destiny now entirely bound to its resilience and the tireless work of the men who fed its hungry flames. Down in the stokehold, Thomas watched the pressure gauges climb, the needles quivering near the edge of warning, reflecting the massive consumption of steam required to hold the ship to its maximum speed through the initial ocean swell. The collective sweat of the gang ran in rivulets across the black floor plates, pooling briefly before evaporating in the oppressive heat radiating from the brick-lined sides of the boilers, rendering the whole space a shimmering, infernal vision. He wiped his streaming eyes with the back of his hand, smearing the grime further, yet he felt a strange, detached pride in the sheer elemental power they were controlling, the fire responding like a beast, obedient only to the constant fear and determination of the men who served it. Later, during the first brief rest period, sitting against a cool bulkhead while the relief gang took over the furnaces, Thomas felt the unfamiliar, deep-seated rhythm of the oceanic voyage, realizing that the earth beneath his feet was no longer solid, but fluid, endlessly shifting and powerful. This new reality, defined by the constant struggle between the engineered strength of the Parnassus and the immeasurable depth of the sea, settled into his consciousness as the true nature of their journey, a continuous, precarious balance. He closed his eyes briefly, the fiery vision of the furnace walls branded onto his inner sight, finding within that inescapable image a dark, necessary beauty that mirrored the relentless sacrifice required to keep the great vessel moving onward toward the distant horizon. Meanwhile, Ilara rose from her bunk and carefully climbed the narrow stairs to the open deck, needing to feel the sharp, cool blast of the night air and gain a momentary perspective on their predicament, escaping the suffocating confines of steerage. The sky above was a vast, glittering dome of cold stars, impossibly distant and silent, offering a humbling contrast to the roaring, mechanical reality of the ship below, which seemed determined to carve its own path regardless of celestial guidance. She looked out over the black water, seeing only the churning phosphorescent wake trailing behind them, a luminous path of foam that vanished almost immediately into the impenetrable darkness, emphasizing the utter isolation of their solitary, swift passage across the breadth of the world. She stayed on deck for a long time, watching the mast sway slightly against the unchanging pattern of the stars, contemplating the vast chasm that now separated them from the familiar security of the land, a chasm filled with deep water and the churning energy of the ship's engines. The sound of the machinery, so menacing and violent from below, here on the open deck, took on a quality of fierce reassurance, a steady, pulsing reminder that the promise of the journey was being paid in full, moment by arduous moment. She finally returned to her bunk, carrying the cold air and the silent magnitude of the ocean back with her, knowing that even in sleep, the ship would continue its powerful, unceasing journey, bearing them closer to their strange, new beginning. The morning watch below deck was an exercise in sustained exhaustion, the heat having intensified further after a night of constant firing, making the very metal of the ship feel baked and alive, too hot to touch for long. Thomas and his fellows moved with the mechanical efficiency born of long practice, their minds numb to the pain and the noise, functioning only as extensions of the shovel and the furnace door, measuring out the black fuel in a rhythmic trance. The work was endless, a cycle of pouring coal into the fiery pit, raking the ash, and then immediately reaching for the next measure. Each ton consumed, moving the entire vessel perhaps a single, measurable mile across the indifferent waves. They spoke in short, guttural demands and grunts, conversation being impossible above the din, but a deep, non-verbal understanding settled among the men, a shared recognition of the profound physical cost of their employment and the mutual reliance they held upon one another's strength. This shared ordeal in the oppressive dark forged an unbreakable bond, a brotherhood defined not by shared pleasure or ease, but by the relentless struggle against the demands of the great engine, the true, hungry sovereign of the Parnassus. Thomas felt a gritty satisfaction in this necessary truth, knowing that in the heart of the ship they were performing the single most vital task, the unseen foundation upon which all the comfortable existence of the passengers rested.